going to rely upon them for an opinion, then they're going to give whatever opinion that is self-serving to them. That's what will happen.
Of course they are.
Okay, so I'm less pissed off that they're lying. I would expect it from them.
I'm more pissed off that our government doesn't hold them to the same standard as other public servants.
Well, that's just it. Because if you were going to have a presentation from a private sector lawyer, and they brought some BS to the table, it would be pointed out, and they would lose their credibility and be sent away. Right? If a government lawyer, in terms of like an agency lawyer or the AG or like a county prosecutor or a lawyer, if they were to present stuff, they're going to come with facts and they're going to show data and they're going to show reports and studies which we can contest. But the problem, which is really the thing, is the subject matter here, and it is not based in any kind of facts, and it's just totally random. And it's just the buzzwords of scare narratives. And I wanted to really address that at the end of the day, but I still think there's a good argument that maybe they shouldn't be doing that, and if so, it should be, sourced. Really, that's what it is. It's sourced. It's not just creating and saying things that are, attached to common fears, true or not, and become exasperated because it's coming from the sheriff who's got a shiny uniform and a badge. But let's talk about the things that he is describing. He was discussing, for example, the medical marijuana law is a joke. No one asked them about that when they got it passed. Yeah. Anyone get a card, okay? But saying that does not mean that he's identifying a problem.
Get as high as you want.
Nothing within any of his complaints other than people having access to it. If you notice that.
Yeah.
Whereas, he didn't say now all these problems exist. He didn't say now.
The root of his comment was that it was difficult to enforce.
He's heard people say now police can spend their time focusing on real crimes with real victims, and then he tried to say they would create those things.
Right. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about that. Real victims, real crimes, driving, break-ins, assaults, drug driving. So that was his concern, because these are the things that are going to happen.
I don't think
but
so.
None of that is based on any hard data or facts. It's just words that are being said.
Yeah.
And I was using the example that he used before we jumped off it with the MMA. But the point is that his disdain for the MMA, of that so many people have access to it, in a way is what he's saying, it's legal for a lot of people.
Yeah.
They get it. They smoke as much as they want. Yeah, and that's how it's going to be with legalization. And when legalization happens, all these terrible things are going to happen. But what he's not recognizing is that if it's true what he thinks and believes about the MMA, all these problems should be happening already. He's predicting what's going to happen when it becomes legal, but he says anyone can get a card. Well, if anyone can get a card and smoke as much as they want, we should expect then there to be real victims of driving and break-ins and assaults.
The Rocky Mountain spiel. Yeah.
He didn't even source. The Rocky Mountain spiel is not valid.
No, he didn't source it, but that's their
Bible.
That's ultimately what it goes back to.
That's what they all use.
They typically talk about Colorado almost, exclusively when they talk about the negative examples of cannabis law reform. And that's because of the Rocky Mountain high-intensity drug trafficking.
The governor is very compelling when he talks about being in opposition in 2014 and now being in support, because it has played itself out for a while and he's seen the benefits. And problems don't come, the money generation does.
Yep. People that are smoking marijuana are doing so today. It's not like there's and Steve Hines
it doesn't just show up.
That you're not going to have this pool of people that are going to be like, oh,
marijuana
is legal.
It's
now
common
I can finally
sense.
Smoke.
More marijuana with legalization, more opportunity for kids to get a hold of it. It's common sense.
Common
It's
sense.
bullshit.
It's common sense.
See that this sheriff has the right to get up here and say this and engage in this debate. I mean, there's a fundamental problem with someone, with a police officer lobbying as to what the law ought to be as opposed to what his pension ought to be or something like that. Because there's a fact, is that the police enjoy the least free speech protections of all public employees.
Huh.
Now, that seems very opposite of what we've seen just recently here in Michigan.
And this is federal precedent in the Constitution. Non-policy making employees can be arrayed on a spectrum from university professors at one end who enjoy broad First Amendment rights to policemen at the other end.
Huh.
because they are fundamentally paramilitary forces.
Nice.
In contrast to the freedom of speech granted to the public in general, this is in polar contrast to the discipline demanded of and the freedom correspondingly denied to policemen, because police forces are a paramilitary force.
But what can't they
Soldiers
say?
can't go lobby at the Capitol and
do.
try to convince
They line
the
soldiers up
government who to
behind
declare war on
politicians.
now. Why would we
They-
allow the police to go determine who they're going to declare?
They
war
put rows of 5-star generals behind presidents every time they say let's go to war. So they certainly use those. But yeah, I'm interested to see that. That's
In Michigan, they weigh in quite a bit.
Oh, no,
on-
we've
on
all been in there when
legislation.
they walked into the Senate
Yes, they
Judiciary
did.
Chamber with guns on.
Yeah.
Michael, remember you and I did a town hall, you and I and Neil on one side, and then we had, it was Charlie Langdon's town hall, and we had one of the...
Dwyer, Chief Dwyer.
Dwyer, yep, who was a sitting police officer at that particular time, come in and debate us about marijuana law reform then.
I did. And there was a one before that with
They should be prohibited from debating.
I
some
agree.
guy that was like a Royal Oak City attorney or something like that, wasn't he?
They had, not Smirtka, was his name?
I remember that dude. I actually got into it with him a little bit in one of those
Yeah.
of Perry's meetings in Royal Oak
Yeah.
one night.
Yeah.
Yep.
Well, here's the thing that people fail to realize a lot of times. I think, a good starting point when you're going to begin a debate about...
Oh, Professor Fisher was there too, wasn't he?
That's
Wasn't-
right.
Also, Professor Gerald Fisher.
I remember saying to him, like, well, at least, Professor, you'll agree with me about this, blah, 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 blah. He's like, no, I don't agree with you. He wrote the white
paper.
Yeah, this is, I think, after he wrote the white paper, wasn't it?
Yeah, but we should
Oh.
pull that out and see
How accurate the white
which
paper's
is what-
predictions
yeah,
were.
what ultimately it...
Well, there's some interesting stories that appear as in there.
the white paper?
In the interesting stories that led to the results of the white paper. In some cases, there's a story related to Dennis Shornack, friend of many of us here, supporter of ours.
Please
And,
elaborate.
he was asked. He is a well-known.
Is it okay with Dennis that you tell the story?
Yeah, well, it's yeah.
All right.
It's public folklore.
It's public, and he's also like in support of Dana and us and all types of stuff. He's pretty open about it these days. He was asked to come in and give a presentation at this township meeting in Ipsy Township by somebody else. Maybe I won't use everybody's name. I'm not sure how much is known or whatever, but and they kind of expected him to be a little bit more restrictive and prohibitive in his views on what was going on. Instead, he showed up and took the angle that there could be some good business opportunities here now with this passage of this new thing, and that he was looking at doing like a condo-style growth thing, finding a big area where they can section off places for people to grow. They don't have the resources in their own houses. And it's early discussion on this kind of stuff, and that is not what they wanted to hear. So if you look in the white paper, there's a section that says like, and some people are thinking this is an opportunity for business. That's not what this is. And it was based on
Right.
that
Dennis
discussion of Dennis.
Interesting. It was, I'll tell you that I'll say this from I think if we were to look back on that event and the issues that were being discussed and the resistance to our position, most of the arguments we put forth probably have prevailed at this point. I mean, they become much more of the accepted understanding. You know what I mean?
Our concerns have been warranted, were warranted, and our successes and our belief in the patient system has been borne out. I think you're right.
And, just it's interesting because this is something, because we're discussing that debate, which was early on about medical marijuana. I was reminded the day I went down to Ohio for a case, and they had just recently passed a Ohio medical marijuana law.
Mm-hmm.
And I was there because my client is a medical marijuana caregiver here, and there was a lot of issues about things for the children. Custody went on, and he needed someone that could help explain the law, but they had just passed the law in Ohio, and it hadn't been implemented yet. And I brought it up to the court. It was probably a judge that was in his last term and been on the bench for a long time. Didn't want to, it was like just from the rewound to the very beginning of Michigan law, like not even want to accept the idea. The council.
Their 2018 is our 2008, right?
Exactly. So it was that exact same experience, and back then the resistance to the things we were saying was just so extreme. But how did that happen? How did that momentum of their brain and the position that they landed on and felt, at least intellectual enough to want to argue for that position and debate about that, where did that, how did they arrive there?
Let me say this. You've seen law enforcement get a pass for bad behavior or be deified by legislatures, both on the state level and federal level, too. So for many, many decades, law enforcement pretty much was able to do anything they wanted unchecked. We just saw a situation in Thetford Township where we had a police chief who thought that he was so comfortable in his position he could take funds he received for publicly given merchandise, put it in his own private account. We see
the money was found.
Yeah,
very much he was vindicated.
Whatever, he wasn't. So the fact is, we see local officers all the time that commit heinous crimes and are just allowed to be released from their position without any criminal charges being filed against them. They have a different set of rules that apply to them than apply to everybody else. So it's no surprise that they display this enormous set of cojones every time they want something. They don't care about lawmakers versus law enforcers. They go do what they want.
If I'm not mistaken, that's a point taken by our soon-to-be Attorney General Dana Nessel, who has expounded on the concept of having a state-centered oversight of police activity instead of leaving it to the local branches to investigate themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Because otherwise you can't weed out, pun intended, the bad ones, the bad apples.
There should be a listing of police officers who have committed crimes for which you should never be allowed to be a police officer ever again.
A crime would preclude them. I think other things such as, search warrants being thrown out because of misstatements, false statements or something like that should be listed somewhere. It shouldn't be free willy-nilly that, they're in court in the morning and the judge makes a ruling finding them at fault in no good faith and suppress a bunch of evidence. They go out and get a search warrant the exact same way in the next case.
Judges should be required to report behavior that they see and they observe like this, especially when magistrates write improper warrants, improper search warrants or arrest warrants. There should be an obligation and a duty to report on the judge's level to a state-based agency who can then at least scorecard these guys, even if they're not able to mete out discipline. They can at least scorecard them so that we can see at a glance who's performing and who's not.
It's kind of interesting. The court system that they complain about police officers and some of this nonsense that they've the propaganda type information that they're writing on. When you go into a court system, and I was talking about this earlier, how lawyers are held to a higher standard, and they're evaluated based on expected to be honest and truthful. I mean, the joke, lawyer doesn't have to take an oath when they go into court because they're presumptively going to speak honestly. They know what that means, and they're able to differentiate an argument versus what's not true, and are required to point out if someone's lying. Okay, so not everyone has to do that. Other people have to take an oath so that they're notified specifically whether they're telling you the truth or not. And of the participants in a criminal case, most of the time, you get the judges, the lawyers, prosecutor, and defense, who are all held to telling the truth and point out, but the police officer in the investigation are not. Right? And I think this is one of these things that, kind of argued about with other police officers who are on our side usually, but, lying to a suspect to get a confession out of them is lawful.
It is.
Does that, and sometimes it, there's one or two officers that can tell me a story of why when they did that and they got the confession it was saved a lot of lives or something to that effect or found some whatever evidence. But it does create a culture, you know what I mean, where in principle if the investigation begins with that and then,
if you're given permission to lie, when do you
right,
know when do you know when you're
point.
not allowed to lie anymore? When do you know when to stop?
And no, really? Okay.
We get a helicopter.
Helicopter during
but
break.
listen, what we're talking about is
Jim up on the table.
everything you're saying, I like the idea that Dana is talking about centralizing But nobody is trying to put the spotlight on the police.
Right.
That's not a thing.
No, they're
We live in a-
loved. They're loved.
Listen.
They're given so much deference in the legislature. It's ridiculous.
And the Constitution. Michigan is